It's Thursday, and while most of the mainstream coverage this morning is fixated on a reported 60-day memorandum of understanding between Washington and Tehran, the more consequential story is unfolding inside Iran itself. U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent this week described the American naval blockade of Iranian ports as a wall of steel and stated that the operation is now costing the Islamic Republic roughly $170 million per day in lost oil revenue. President Donald Trump went further, characterizing Iran as negotiating on fumes. For context, this is not standard diplomatic posturing. The underlying data suggests the regime led by Mojtaba Khamenei, who succeeded his father Ali Khamenei after the latter was killed in the opening U.S.-Israeli strikes on February 28th, is in the worst fiscal position it has faced since 1979. So in this video, we're going to take a look at why Iran's leverage is largely illusory, unpack the hyperinflation now gripping the country, and explain why the most dangerous metric for Tehran isn't the price of bread, but the military payroll. Let's start with the oil picture, because this is where the gap between perception and reality is widest. The mainstream framing has been that Iran holds the cards through its grip on the Strait of Hormuz, which normally carries oil and LNG equivalent to roughly 20% of global consumption. However, while Iran has succeeded in halting most non-Iranian shipping through the strait, it has been almost entirely unable to export its own crude. Karg Island, which handles around 90% of Iranian oil exports in normal times, has been paralyzed since the U.S. naval blockade began on April 13th. According to maritime satellite data tracked by analysts including Windward AI, the terminal saw essentially no tanker loadings for a 10-day stretch ending around May 18th, with a record 23 to 26 vessels observed anchored offshore as floating storage, including the 30-year-old derelict tanker Nasha. A suspected oil slick covering 70 to 120 square kilometers was detected near the terminal in early May, with roughly 80,000 barrels estimated to have leaked into the Gulf. Brent crude, meanwhile, has been trading in a volatile band between $94 and $99 a barrel this week, down from an April peak of around $138. Iran cannot export a meaningful drop to capitalize on any of it. This brings us to the domestic consequences, which are remarkably severe. According to the Statistical Center of Iran, official annual inflation reached 73.5% for the month ending April 20th, and the IMF projects the Iranian economy will contract by 6.1% this year. The rial has lost over 60% of its value in recent months, with the exchange rate now sitting at roughly 1.32 million rials to the dollar. For ordinary Iranians, this has translated into a hyperinflationary shock in basic goods, as partial internet access has returned over the past week, following an 88-day nationwide blackout. Footage and reporting trickling out shows a tray of eggs now selling for around 600,000 tomans, chicken at roughly 290,000 tomans per kilo, and vegetable oil prices up between 308 and 375% year on year. More than 40 million Iranians, or nearly half the population of around 85 million, are now estimated to be living in absolute poverty. A letter signed by 170 Iranian MPs reportedly warned the government of a potential social explosion. For context, this is not the first time a regime has spent itself into this position. The Soviet Union in the 1980s maintained one of the largest military apparatuses in history, spending an estimated 15 to 17% of GDP on defense, while ordinary citizens queued for bread and the state poured resources into Afghanistan, Cuba, and Angola. The Reagan-era U.S. strategy was, in part, a deliberate effort to force Moscow into unsustainable defense spending. The parallel to Iran's funding of Hezbollah, the Houthis, and Iraqi and Syrian militias, alongside its ballistic missile program, is fairly direct. The structural pattern historically is that regimes survive economic pain right up until the apparatus of coercion stops being reliably paid. And this brings us to what is arguably the most significant claim in this entire story. In addition to the blockade figures, Bessent explicitly stated this week that Iranian troops are not being paid and that Iranian police are failing to report for work. For the Islamic Republic, this is a structurally different problem from inflation. The IRGC, Iran's elite ideological force, retains independent revenue streams through construction, energy, and import businesses, giving it considerable financial insulation. The regular armed forces, the Artish, and the conventional police do not. According to classified U.S. intelligence cited in recent reporting, Iran still retains roughly 70% of its pre-war missile stockpile, and around 30 of 33 missile sites along the strait are operational. The hardware is largely intact. The question is whether the regime can pay the humans operating it. Ultimately, when Iranian negotiators in Doha threaten to walk away, or when Tehran launches a ballistic missile at a U.S. base in Kuwait, as it did on May 27th, this should not be read as a signal of strength. It looks far more like the behavior of a government for which missiles are now cheaper than functioning supermarkets, and for which the cost of projecting power abroad is being borne by an increasingly impoverished and unpaid domestic base. Whether that gap closes through a deal in the coming weeks or through something considerably more disorderly inside Iran itself remains to be seen.